Hello, and thank you so much for joining us. I'm Greg Williams, and I'm joined by Jens Strømnes from Expert to discuss how retailers can navigate turmoil. So Jens, terrific to have you with us today. Really interested to get your thoughts on sort of various topics. But the first one I think I'd really like to get into is the obvious question around the massive changes that we've seen over the past couple of years. Obviously, there's an ongoing geopolitical situation as well as COVID having impacted us. So I'm really curious to get your sense of what the big trends are that you've seen in consumer behavior over the past 2 years, and which of these shifts that we've seen, which are going to be permanent and which are going to diminish and disappear over time.
I think, Greg, that a lot of the changes that we've seen, and we've really seen a lot of changes, are going to be permanent. I think from a consumer perspective, we've seen a much bigger acceptance of technology, and we've seen new demographics accepting technology. So think grandparents suddenly FaceTiming their grandchildren, consumers accepting contactless payment, cashless payment to a much larger extent than in the past. I think also this has led to higher kind of online shares in transactions, in purchasing, that people are buying more online, but also that people are more actively using online tools as a part of their customer journey. So things like pre-purchase research, etc. And another one that is maybe less directly only on consumer behavior, but impacting it, but is something that I think we see that a lot of us are focusing a lot on the things that are close to us. So be that kind of our families, our homes, our local communities, that these have really gotten a lot more focus than in the past. And in our case, we have a lot of stores that are rooted in local communities, and this is something that a trend that we see as a real opportunity for us as well.
Yeah, it was interesting during the pandemic. I was doing sort of a conversation with people at Google, and they were talking to me a little bit about what they were seeing in terms of search, and localization really was just such a massive topic. People were looking to consume services and products from local stores, and there was a real sense in which I think that the end of the city has been much discussed. I don't necessarily agree with that, the city centre, I mean. But I also think that there is clearly now this kind of spreading out of neighbourhoods into sort of very vital kind of communities. And that, I don't think that trend's going to go away. I remember doing a story a few years ago about the future of retail. And I spoke to the biggest supermarket chain in the UK, and I also spoke to luxury goods manufacturers, amongst many other luxury goods retailers, I should say. And everyone used the same word. Everyone used the word omnichannel. I'm really intrigued to know from your perspective what that means for Expert and how data really plays into that.
I think the first thing is really, what do we mean by omnichannel? Because everyone seems to have their own take on it. When we talk about omnichannel in our organization, we really talk about how we align physical retail to all the digital tools that we have to give the consumer one holistic experience based on their wants and their needs. So that's really what we strive for, this kind of more holistic approach across all different touch points, whether they're physical or whether they're digital. As an organization, though, with a kind of heritage and a history in physical retail, where a lot of the stores are also operated by independent retailers, I see that a big part of the conversation as well is about highlighting the opportunities that omnichannel transformation is for physical retail as well. For us, it's not only about, or not even primarily about, selling as much as possible online. It's also a lot about how do we guide the consumer through the journey? How do we enable pre-purchase research? How do we inform them of services and solutions we're offering? How do we provide them information with where we are when we're open, etc., how they can contact us? But also that when omnichannel is well implemented and we have consumers in store, that we engage with them, that we are selling products that we might not have on the rack because we have access to them through good omnichannel solutions, be that when consumers choose click and collect as a delivery option, that we engage with the consumer, use that conversation to upsell, sell additional services and products, etc., and really just kind of develop the relationship with the consumer that way.
And I'm interested also, I mean, obviously a lot of electronics are commodity purchases, right? So you can, buy the same, whatever it is, washing machine from a number of different retailers. But presumably there are still also electronics products that are so high touch that consumers, they don't want to buy them online. They might do the kind of like the pre-purchase research, as you say, and maybe there'll be an engagement in terms of kind of like, whittling down, if you like, the kind of products they might be interested in. But presumably there's also a real place for that physical interaction in store with a salesperson, a real kind of sense of kind of, learning and communication going on.
I think there are differences between markets here on online purchasing behavior. Of course, Europe isn't Europe. I mean, there are massive differences between North, Central, and South. But what we typically see is it's exactly what you're saying, Greg, that there are certain products where many consumers and the majority of consumers prefer to buy in store, typically when it's larger investments. And I think there's two main reasons behind that. One is the wish to, as I say, talk to somebody to get guidance on the enormous selection there is and the possibilities there are, but not only related to the products. If we talk about big appliances or big TVs, delivery, installation, taking care of the old one you have at home is a factor that people often want to talk about in store. And the second thing is the experience piece. If you're investing in a new high-end TV, you want to see the quality of the screen you're buying in a demonstration. When you're replacing your fridge, we all tend to want to kind of slam the door when we visit the store to get a perception and a feel for the product that we're buying. So I think this is something that we continue to see for some products. But even for more commoditized products, when we do research, when we ask consumers and look at data on their behavior, we see that a lot of consumers also want to buy commodity items in store, very often just linked with convenience, that they can pick it off the shelf and take it home straight away.
That's interesting. So just let's dig into that a little bit. Like, what are you seeing in the data generally when it comes to that sense of, what consumers are after when they come in store?
Well, it's sometimes difficult to measure, though, to kind of bridge what did the consumers do online before visiting the store. I mean, apart from just through conversation. But what we are seeing, as I said, is that typically, of course, more convenience items, smaller items, things that you replace, but it's a low emotional involvement in the purchasing. So, say your hand mixer in the kitchen is breaking, or your toaster or your kettle, it's a low involvement purchase. A lot of people replace these regularly and will do so online. Whereas if it's something that is more going to be key to your everyday at home, or something where you might hope for an improvement of your kind of day-to-day flow, or convenience-driven things, like you're replacing your washing machine and you're more interested in learning on what happened since 10 years ago when you last replaced your washing machine, that you really seek more detailed information. And that's where I think that human conversation with sales staff also plays a bigger role than on a more commoditized item.
That's such an interesting observation, because consumers clearly now are so well informed. They've done their research. They look at ratings, they look at rankings. They come into sort of stores, I imagine, really with a kind of a degree of expertise that maybe they didn't have in the past. And certainly when people are searching online, they have access to, pretty much all the information that we've ever, human beings have ever created. And what we're seeing, I think, in so many digital products, obviously, is personalization. You only have to look at something like healthcare, a product like a fitness tracking app, or some kind of like a smartwatch. So I think this kind of degree of personalization in terms of our experiences, whether that's in retail, or whether that's frankly with fintech or banking, those kinds of products and services are becoming more and more important to people. So I'm curious to get your thoughts on this trend towards personalization. How can we kind of best adapt popular products and services to the needs of individuals from your perspective?
Well, I think you need to know who you're dealing with, right, in terms of the customer. And when we talk about personalization, of course, there's a lot of data-related talk. So how does AI and machine learning, et cetera, help us process the amount of data that we have access through today, typically transactional data, and loyalty programs, etc., but also online behavior of consumers. So it's very often a digitalized discussion. What I think will help us tremendously in our industry in the future is that more and more of the products we're selling are IoT enabled, right? So they're connected to the internet. And that enables also user data to be extracted from your smart TV, from your dishwasher. That again will enable more of a customized proposition, be that reminding you of when a service is needed, be that on supplying you with consumables like detergent, etc. And here I think we'll see a big difference. Today, though, this data is only accessed by the manufacturer of the product. The European Union is working on initiatives to give consumers the choice of who they give access, and I believe that as retailers, if we can get access with the consent of the consumer to this data, we're able to personalize to a much larger extent. But I have maybe one additional thought, because these discussions on personalizations tend to be extremely data-driven, and that's going to develop and be even more important for us in the future. But if you think to your own personal life of personalized experiences, think of an experience of visiting a 5-star hotel or kind of a star restaurant, where you have a person that is listening to you, that is reading your wish off your lips, so to speak, and that's using their experience and intuition to tailor the experience ongoingly to you. And I think when we talk about personalization and what we spoke about before, Greg, about local stores and where you might know people, it's in your local community, I think this personal service as a part of personalization is something that we sometimes overlook, and I think that's something that might play a bigger role also in the future.
Yeah, that's interesting, because that kind of touches on trust as well, because I think that we all want personalized, products, we want personalized services. But as you said, there has to be this idea of consent, and it has to be, always driven by the consumer and their needs. Going back to that kind of physical store aspect, staff in store, how best to kind of give them the data that they need to serve customers?
I think this is one of the big challenges we have as retail, certainly when I look at Europe in terms of data protection in Europe and how consumers respond to this, is that when consumers are engaging with us digitally, we have a very comprehensive set of data that we can immediately use. So if I look at some of our retail affiliates in countries where they have very well developed customer loyalty programs, consumer apps, etc., we know all the different touch points on how the consumer, what they're looking at, what they bought in the past, what tends to trigger a purchase. We see when they scan QR codes in store to get more information. We know what products they're looking at. But what is challenging today is to bridge that knowledge when a consumer, like most consumers, are sometimes buying online and sometimes in store, that we identify that consumer in store, because today typically it tends to happen at the checkout at the till when a customer is purchasing. So I think this is where all of us, certainly from a European perspective, might be different in China, for instance, where tools are utilized differently, but where we have a challenge on kind of using that data, because to use the data, you need to have identified the customer that is physically in your store. There is, of course, an opportunity for learning from general data, which is not then the ultimate personalization, but using data in staff training to teach staff that, okay, consumers that are typically responding to those kind of products also have an interest in other products, so they should be approached with that proposition, or learning from general behavior data. But I don't know if you see good examples in other industries of how this kind of like online, offline consumer data is being bridged well.
Well, I think that you raised the point of China. I think that like China is a super interesting example, because obviously there's a very different relationship between sort of privacy and the amount of data that people are willing to give up within China compared to Europe or the US. And we see use of sort of facial recognition technology. We see AI being employed to kind of predict the way that people will move around stores, and look at the way that their eyes are, where they're looking on shelves, so we can kind of see exactly the kind of goods that they're looking at. We've also seen, really interesting sort of work, some of it coming out of the MIT Media Lab, around sort of like what they call emotional AI. So kind of using cameras to scan people's faces and understand their emotions. And that's being deployed. It has been deployed by both brands, but also by people who are trying to sending out political messages to understand how people feel in that moment when a certain message is given. So I think that we have to, again, you raised the point around IoT and consumer consent and privacy. These are probably not technologies that are going to be widely deployed in Europe. But I think that what's interesting is that some consumers do want that kind of personalization. They do want that kind of sense of brands and platforms understanding what it is that they're looking for. So kind of like balancing that with privacy is going to be a really sort of challenging sort of a real interesting challenge for many brands and for platforms certainly. I want to move on to another challenge now, Jens. We're hearing so much about this now. Every day I pick up the Financial Times and there's another story related to supply chains and the challenge around supply chains across so many industries. So I want to get a sense for you on how reliant the electronics industry is on access to the right components, right?
Or the manufacturers that we work with, whose products we're retailing, tremendously so, of course. And what we've seen, like everyone over the last 2 years, is that literally the smallest component in the product can be the one that brings everything to a halt. So in terms of supply chain, massively challenging, although improving slightly right now. But what we're seeing in our industry, if you look at household appliances, for instance, there's still a lot of production in Europe. But also they have been tremendously affected because components are coming from everywhere. So what I think that we will be seeing more of, and it's been a hot discussion topic talking to our suppliers, is really about how their suppliers of components are moving production closer to production sites to be able to have a more seamless component planning and to have less challenges. If you think of Intel, for instance, pledging huge investments in manufacturing in Europe to support not only the electronics industry and household appliances, but also car manufacturers, etc., and other companies like Intel. I think this is something that we'll see a lot in our sector, maybe more than kind of reshoring of production itself, is that where production is onshore, that component manufacturing is more kind of being centered around it.
Jens, I think that's such a great point. Clearly, the electronics industry is kind of underpinned by really a need for quite scarce resources. And we're seeing a kind of a movement towards different kinds of products designed in different ways as a response to this, thinking about sort of sustainability and other issues. And there's obviously a new kind of approach to design coming about, which is modular design, so we can kind of plug components in rather than replacing entire devices. There's this right to repair movement, consumers wanting access to be able to repair devices rather than replace them. Can you just kind of talk a little bit about that and whether you feel that there is this kind of real shift in the way that we think about how kind of electronics operate in terms of are replacing them so regularly?
I think the shift is coming very fast, and it's one of the biggest topics of discussion, whether it is when we talk to legislators or when we talk to our suppliers and within our own group. We believe that repair will be more important in the future, both from a legislative point of view, that you're able and willing to offer your consumer side service, but also as a consumer request, we're well set up, given that we have a historic focus on installation and technical capabilities. We have a huge network able to do it. I think big change we'll see is what you mentioned as well. How are products designed by the manufacturers with repairability and upgrading in mind from the very beginning? So be that about more conscious decisions around components, be that about shared components across products so that you're able to repair in a pragmatically speaking way. But one of the things that I think we've seen little of so far in our industry, but that we're beginning to see in electric vehicles, for instance, think of how Tesla kind of revolutionized the use of upgrades, of software upgrades to optimize the use of the hardware. be that on kind of like adjusting range, driving range on your car, adding features and capabilities that give you as a consumer a better experience. And I think that these possibilities to remotely upgrade and change products is something that we will see more of in the future, but that we're so far seeing a bit less of in our industry.
So it's so interesting you talk about Tesla, Jens. I mean, we are obviously seeing this massive, very, very quick shift from internal combustion engine vehicles to electric. And clearly that is one of the trends that is going to, that is going to be ongoing. We're never going back to, petrol and diesel vehicles. What kind of an impact do you think that's going to have on the electronics industry?
I think what we've seen already is that many of the suppliers of our products have now also become huge suppliers of technology to the vehicle industry, to the extent that if you think back, Greg, to CES in 2020, Sony unveiled an electric vehicle study of their own to showcase their capabilities. So I think that it does kind of like blur the landscape a little bit in terms of supply of electronics, but it's also a huge opportunity, I think, because we more and more surround ourselves with smart and intelligent devices. So, I mean, now it's also then the car, it's already your phone, it's your TV, it's more and more of household appliances when we spoke about Internet of Things before, that are smart as well. And I think that both the challenge, but also the huge opportunity is how we kind of like combine those and improve how different products are talking to each other to support our consumers, to give them a better everyday and to enable them to be supported in the best possible way.
Let's continue with that theme of the future. So I'm going to ask you to sort of like gaze into your crystal ball, Jens, if that's okay. Let's look ahead 10 years. Give us a sense of what you think the retail landscape is going to look like.
I think it's never been more difficult to look into the future than right now. But I think if you look into the future, I think the kind of digital advancements that we're seeing and that have been accelerated also over the last 2 years, I think they will just continue. I think in terms of the digital touch points we have with our consumers, it will be different. As I said, with the access to data, not only from transactions, but also from the use of the products in the future, will change retail quite a lot. It will enable a lot of platform-related businesses, collaborations that we're not seeing today, shift from, in our case, very often just selling the product to also selling services and consumables for the consumer to use throughout the lifetime of the product. I think, though, omnichannel will be the standard. I believe in physical retail also for the future. I believe we might have less physical stores. I believe that the stores of the future will need to be very focused on how they serve their consumer, whether it's then focused around convenience, whether it's focused around experience, but that they serve a very, very clear focus that cannot be duplicated online, but that kind of like underpins this entire omnichannel approach to retail.
Well, Jens, we'll have to get together in 10 years to see, if your predictions were right. But it's been fascinating chatting to you. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you all for joining us today. Have a great day.
My pleasure. Thank you, Greg.